You know, when we picture a military takeover, we usually think of conquests, and we definitely think of fear. But what if it was met with a celebration? We're going to go back to the very early days of the Taliban's rise, to a specific moment on a dusty battlefield that really challenges everything you think you know about how power is won. Let's dig in.
Okay, so let's set the scene. We're in Pashmul, a small village in Afghanistan. The fighting has just stopped. You can imagine the air is still thick with smoke, and that ringing silence after gunfire has just fallen. This is ground zero for our story.
And the incredible thing is, we can see this moment through the eyes of someone who was actually there, a fighter named Mullah Juma Khan. His account lets us get past the military tactics and into the raw, human side of what was about to happen.
And what happened next? Well, nobody saw it coming. Instead of cowering in fear, the fighters were met with actual joy. Men, women, even children started streaming out of their homes. Some of them even brought their livestock with them, which is a powerful, powerful gesture of welcome. This wasn't a surrender, it was a celebration.
So you have to ask yourself, why? I mean, why would an entire community welcome an armed group that had just taken their village by force? Well, the answer isn't about who was arriving, it's about who had just been kicked out.
And the answer came straight from the villagers themselves. They said, "We're glad you chased those gunmen away." So this wasn't really about welcoming the Taliban per se. It was about celebrating the end of something else. It was an expression of pure, absolute relief.
To really get the depth of that relief, you have to understand the sheer horror that came before it. What exactly had these people been forced to live through?
The accounts from the villagers, they're just harrowing. They talk about a level of cruelty that is hard to even imagine, finding the bodies of murdered women just dumped in ditches behind checkpoints. And they were the ones who had to find them and bury them. This wasn't just chaos, it was a constant state of terror.
So you see this really stark contrast. On one side, you had the warlords' rule, just violent lawlessness, atrocities, and constant gnawing fear. And on the other side, what the Taliban seemed to offer, a sense of safety, disciplined conduct, a return to some kind of order. For people who had been through the absolute worst, this was a trade they were more than ready to make.
So how does this one moment, in one small village, build into a massive regional campaign? Well, what happened in Pashmul wasn't just a fluke. It was the first crucial step in a much larger and very disciplined advance.
Their strategy just unfolded from there. After Pashmul, they kept moving. It was methodical. They went to Sanzari, then to the Shah Aga crossroads, clearing out those abusive warlord checkpoints one by one. Every move was deliberate, extending their control step by step, all leading towards the major prize, Kandahar.
But it wasn't a straight shot. Along the way, they ran into a major test. They came face to face with Commander Sarkatib, a leader from Hezb Islami, which was another powerful faction in the area. Now this was a moment that could have easily blown up into another battle.
But that's not what happened. Instead, we see this moment of just pure pragmatism. Sarkatib didn't fight them. He kept his own checkpoints up, but he gave the Taliban safe passage to move through his territory. This wasn't some grand alliance, not at all. It was a cautious understanding that just allowed the advance to keep going without more bloodshed.
And their next move, honestly, it was strategically brilliant. They set up a base in a place called Dand, which basically wedged them right between two other major warlords. They were no longer just some roving group of fighters. They had just become a new power broker right in the heart of the region. And it's right here, as they start to solidify their position, that the movement's core philosophy really comes into focus. It was all defined by the personal leadership of Mullah Omar, and it's centered on this idea of invitation over confrontation.
This whole approach is known as Dawah. At its heart, it's the act of invitation, of persuasion. So instead of always leading with force, the strategy was to first try to win people over by appealing to a higher, moral purpose.
And this wasn't some top-down strategy carried out by messengers. No, Mullah Omar's method was incredibly personal, incredibly direct. He basically put himself on the front line of this ideological fight.
I mean, just think about the sheer audacity of this. He would literally walk right up to the checkpoints of his rivals, armed posts run by hardened commanders, and personally urge them to give up their positions and, crucially, to stop tormenting the people. And this right here is the key. The appeal was framed in moral terms. The message wasn't, "we want power," it was, "we need to end the suffering and restore justice."
And that message resonated deeply with fighters and civilians alike who were just sick and tired of the cruelty and corruption.
And you know what? It worked. This combination of disciplined military moves and a direct moral appeal, it created this kind of quiet force, a powerful momentum. It was building legitimacy from the ground up, and it really struck a chord in communities that were desperate for any alternative to the chaos they'd been living in.
And all of this leaves us with a really difficult question. The story of what happened in Pashmul, it reveals a complex truth about conflict and about what people will accept when things get bad enough. It forces us to ask, when a population is pushed to the absolute brink of desperation, what is the true price of order?
You know, when we think about the Taliban's rise back in the mid-90s, our minds usually jump straight to images of force, of conflict. But what if I told you that their very first strategy wasn't about fighting at all? It was about negotiation. We're going to dig into the often overlooked story of how their power began, with a patient 5-week campaign to win control not with guns, but with words.
And this was their message. Simple, right? Not some grand declaration of war, but a really powerful demand. This single sentence, well, it gets right to the heart of the problem that was plaguing southern Afghanistan in 1994, and it basically sets the stage for everything that comes next. It was a promise of order in a land that had fallen into chaos.
So to really get why that message hit so hard, you have to understand what was happening on the ground. Kandahar, at this time, well, there was no central government to speak of. It was more like a patchwork of territories, all carved up and controlled by local militia commanders. And of course, each one had their own rules and their own checkpoints.
And those chains they talked about? Yeah, they were literal. Actual chains were stretched across the roads to stop travelers, to stop traders, who were then shaken down for money and harassed. But those chains were also this powerful metaphor for the complete lack of freedom and security that the average person was dealing with every single day.
It's into this chaotic scene that the Taliban arrive in September of 1994. And their first move, it wasn't an attack. It was an offer to sit down and talk. They kicked off this period of really intense negotiation, all aimed at persuading these local commanders to just give up their power peacefully.
And look, this wasn't some brief, half-hearted attempt. We're talking about 5 full weeks dedicated to this one single objective. That length of time, it shows a really deliberate patience, a persistent effort to achieve their goal of removing those chains through diplomacy first.
So you can see it here. This sustained effort lasted from the moment they arrived in early September all the way to the middle of October. The focus, the entire time, was squarely on dialogue. This wasn't a rush to grab power. It was a methodical, diplomatic campaign.
And this whole strategy, it wasn't being carried out by some low-level envoys. It was personally led by the movement's leader, Mullah Omar. He became the face and the voice of this diplomatic push, meeting with the region's powerful figures one by one.
By all accounts, his approach was defined by 2 things: calm and clarity. There were no threats, no grand, fiery speeches. It was just a direct, straightforward presentation of the movement's goals. He would explain their aim to bring security and order and just ask for their cooperation. And the people he was meeting with, these were the region's most powerful players. We're talking about Sarkatib, Abdul Alim, Amir Lali. These were the established commanders in Kandahar. And that's the crucial point, right? This was high-stakes, face-to-face diplomacy with the very people who held all the power. And maybe nothing shows how dedicated they were to this strategy more than this next part. They even approached their former ideological enemies. Mansour, for example, was a former communist commander, the very people the Mujahideen had been fighting for years. And yet, Mullah Omar went to him directly, in person, and actually convinced him to take down his barriers. It was just this extraordinary act of pragmatism over politics.
So, with Kandahar city mostly secured through these talks, the strategy was then extended to the absolutely crucial border town of Spin Boldak. Now, this was a major stronghold for armed militias and a key trade route, and it was suffering from the exact same kind of oppression. The diplomatic test was about to get a whole lot bigger.
The process they used was pretty fascinating. First, they extended that same peaceful invitation, but they did it through respected local figures. This started to create pressure from within, because some commanders accepted the terms, and they then went and confronted those who were hesitating. It was a brilliant strategy designed to isolate the opposition without ever firing a shot. And you know what? At first, it worked incredibly well. Faced with this unified front and a clear demand from the public, influential commanders like Habibullah John and Nader John, They just packed up and left. They retreated without a fight. Persuasion had actually won the day. But diplomacy, no matter how patient or how persuasive it is, always has its limits. And in Spin Boldak, the Taliban's non-violent strategy was about to slam into a wall. Those 5 weeks of talking, well, they were coming to an end.
The challenge was pretty simple. While a lot of commanders were swayed by the promise of order or by public pressure, a core group absolutely refused to disarm. For them, their weapons were the source of their power, their wealth, and they weren't about to give all that up just based on words alone. And specifically, it all came down to a few key figures, like Muhammad Nabi and Akhtar Muhammad. Their refusal to stand down marked the definitive end of the purely diplomatic phase. That simple request to remove the chains had been officially rejected.
So this leaves us with a really critical question. The Taliban's rise to power began not with force, but with this patient 5-week negotiation for order. But what happens to a movement that's built on persuasion when persuasion just isn't enough anymore? The refusal of a few commanders would force a decision that wouldn't just secure the region, it would end up redefining the Taliban for decades to come.
You know, the Taliban's first major military victory wasn't some chaotic, messy battle. It was, in fact, a masterclass in strategy. It was a win that was secured weeks before through silent preparation and then executed with almost surgical precision. Today, we're going to break down exactly how they captured Spin Boldak.
So, let me ask you this. How is a victory actually won before the first shot is even fired? The answer to that question is really the key to this whole operation, and it has nothing to do with firepower. It's all about patience, careful preparation, and absolute discipline. You see, the path to this victory didn't start with a battlefield charge. No. It began with silence. For over a month in the Don district, there were no fights, no skirmishes, just this period of quiet, disciplined growth.
And this period of stillness, well, that was the very first phase of their strategy, building a rock-solid foundation of strength and, just as importantly, legitimacy.
But don't mistake quiet for inactivity. This was actually a time of immense growth. The movement was attracting new fighters, it was forging this incredible internal discipline, and it was building up the kind of momentum that would be absolutely crucial for what was about to happen.
And then came a really pivotal moment. Respected veterans from the anti-Soviet jihad, we're talking living legends, began to arrive, pledging their support. Figures like Mullah Mohammed Rabbani, Mullah Mohammed Ghaus, Mullah Borjan Akhund, and Mullah Nuruddin Tarabi. Now, these weren't just new recruits. They were powerful symbols of legitimacy.
The arrival of these commanders was a game changer. It directly neutralized one of the key accusations their opponents were throwing at them, this idea that the Taliban had no real connection to the celebrated jihad. Well, the reality was now impossible to ignore. Their leadership was filled with veteran mujahideen, tying their movement directly to that powerful legacy.
This period of growth was then cemented with a critical appointment. Mullah Mohammed Akhund became the movement's overall military commander. This decision signaled a major shift from being a sort of loose collection of fighters to a truly organized command structure ready for coordinated action.
All of this careful preparation, all this building of legitimacy, it was all leading to a single inevitable turning point: the decision for war.
Now, this path to conflict wasn't an impulsive one. For weeks, the Taliban actually tried a peaceful approach with the local warlords, but that went nowhere. By early October, the commanders in Spin Boldak were openly threatening war. So finally, on October 10th, the decision was made. Mullah Omar authorized a military operation.
And that was it. The order was given. The military operation to capture Spin Boldak was officially authorized. The time for quiet preparation was over.
So, with the order in hand, the operation shifted into its next phase: meticulous and deeply secret preparation. The strategy itself was a model of discipline. First, they hand-picked an elite force, just 5 of the best fighters from each group. They were then moved to an empty compound, completely isolated, then concealed inside trucks. And here's the final, critical piece of secrecy. The fighters themselves had no idea what their target was until they were already on the move. The leadership was just as carefully selected. This operation would be led by commanders Mullah Abdul Khalik Akhund, Mullah Hamidullah Akhund, and Mullah Mohammed, who was a close companion of Mullah Rabbani.
So in total, you've got a force of about 100 elite fighters. And get this, they were loaded into just 2 Hino trucks. Think about that. an incredibly small and mobile force for such a significant objective. To maintain absolute secrecy, to make sure they could slip past any militia checkpoints, the trucks were completely covered with tarpaulins. Nobody watching them go by could possibly know who or what was inside, or where they were even going. This force was moving like a ghost toward its target. And now, we get to the execution, a victory that was as swift as it was decisive. Right before entering the town, the convoy halts. The tarps come off. The fighters are organized into their units, and each unit is given a specific target. The final briefing is done. The assault is about to begin.
The assault was launched with that same incredible position. One truck drove straight into the district administration compound. The second truck stopped and immediately secured a key checkpoint, cutting off any route for escape or reinforcements.
The fighters dismounted and moved with incredible speed. In what was a remarkably short amount of time, they seized every primary objective: the main administration building, the police headquarters, the courthouse, and other key positions. The entire western side of the town. It fell almost instantly. Now, after this initial, lightning-fast success, there was actually a 2-day standoff. The warlords fell back to the eastern side of Boldak and dug in. And during this pause, tribal elders came in and tried to negotiate a peaceful resolution, and the Taliban forces, with discipline, just waited. But the negotiations failed. On the evening of the second day, a final clash erupted, and the warlords were decisively defeated. The victory, planned in silence weeks before, was now complete. The result was undeniable. Spin Boldak was now fully under Taliban control.
Today, we're going to break down a pivotal moment in a conflict. A moment where a single piece of intelligence, delivered in the dead of night, completely unraveled a deadly plot. This is the story of the Buldak Deception.
So it all boils down to this one question, really. How can one warning, just a single piece of information delivered at the perfect time, stop a conspiracy dead in its tracks? We're going to unpack how a secret, coordinated attack was foiled, well, before it even had a chance to start.
Okay, so to really understand the plot, you first have to understand the setting. It all kicks off with the capture of a town called Boldak. And this one event, well, it suddenly put a little-known movement on the world map.
Yeah, the fall of Boldak was a huge turning point, not just on the battlefield, but in terms of awareness. Suddenly, through radio broadcasts, people all over the country and even the world knew about the Taliban. This was the moment they really stepped onto the world stage.
But here's the thing about that sudden media spotlight. It kind of created a historical misunderstanding, because the press really only started paying attention after Boldak. A lot of writers, both local and foreign, just assumed the whole movement started right there. The truth? The uprising had actually kicked off almost 3 months earlier, in a completely different town.
So, with Boldak secured, the Taliban leadership started to settle into a new routine. But that very predictability, that pattern of daily life, well, it created a dangerous vulnerability they didn't see coming.
So the day after the takeover was complete, Mullah Omar showed up to talk with his commanders. And what's really fascinating is their strategy at this point. I mean, even after this major military win, they still believe the powerful gunmen back in Kandahar could be convinced, through dialogue, to change their ways.
And maybe this belief in a peaceful solution led to a bit of a comfortable, predictable routine. Every night at home, every day, the same journey to the main base, and every day, passing through the exact same checkpoints. This pattern, it was about to become the centerpiece of a very deadly plan. Now, not everyone was celebrating the fall of Boldak. For the powerful commanders in nearby Kandahar, it was a massive shock. It forced them to take this new group very, very seriously. And their response? It was swift, and it was secret. You see, up until this point, Kandahar's warlords didn't really see the Taliban as a major threat. But now, they suddenly realized this movement could actually break their grip on power. The fear was real. And that fear, it pushed them to act. So, just a few days later, they hold this secret meeting, late at night. Pretty much every top commander was in that room, with one key exception. And their goal was singular. It was decisive. Organize and launch a crushing counterattack. And the strategy they came up with was a two-pronged attack. It was designed to cut the head off the snake and crush its base at the same time. The first part, an assassination. The man tasked with the job was Sar Kateb, the very commander whose checkpoints Mullah Omar passed through every single day. The second part,
a massive joint assault on Boldak itself.
And that was it. No one disagreed. Everyone at that meeting approved the plan. They all swore they would do their part. The plot was officially a go.
But you know how these things go. A plan made in secret doesn't always stay secret for long. A single quiet decision made in the shadows of that very meeting was about to change absolutely everything. Think about this. Less than 2 hours. In under 2 hours from the moment those commanders sealed their deadly pact, the entire plot was completely exposed.
And just like that, the most important element, surprise, was gone. The hunters were, in an instant, about to become the hunted.
So how did it all leak? Well, it turns out one of the commanders in that secret meeting was actually a quiet sympathizer. As soon as the meeting was over, he traveled through the night, taking a huge personal risk to deliver a warning face to face. And the response was immediate. There was no hesitation. Mullah Omar, who was always in radio contact with his forces, got on the horn right away and relayed everything to his commander in Boldak. The warning was received and the order was given. Get ready for an attack. So, with the warning delivered and received, the meticulously planned counteroffensive of the Kandahar commanders just began to fall apart. The whole thing collapsed before it could even get started.
The first part of their plan, the assassination, it failed in the simplest way you can imagine. The next day, Mullah Omar just didn't make his usual trip. The ambush was all set up, but the target never showed. And just like that, Sarkiteb's plot completely fizzled out.
But they didn't just sit back and play defense. This is a perfect example of how good intelligence can turn defense into offense. Knowing the enemy's plan, the Taliban actually pushed forward to strengthen their own lines. They even captured new territory without firing a shot, because the local commanders there had already pulled back. The Kandahar forces, their plan now totally exposed, could do nothing but retreat and try to regroup. The initiative was completely lost.
So when you think about it, the Kandahar commanders had tanks, they had artillery, they had more men. The Taliban had a warning. It really leaves you with a critical question, doesn't it? In the end, what's truly more powerful? The weapon in your hand or the warning in your ear?
You know, Kandahar, it's so much more than just a city. It's really the strategic and, you could say, spiritual heartland of southern Afghanistan. It was its first capital, and the thing is, if you control Kandahar, you pretty much control the south. So what we're going to do here is give you a tactical breakdown of how this absolutely pivotal city was captured.
Wow, that quote, it really captures the sheer gravity of what happened. This wasn't just some battle. We're talking about a fundamental shift in the country's entire balance of power. So let's dive right in, starting with the opening moves of the campaign.
Okay, so the initial assault. This was truly a test of wills. It didn't kick off with a surprise attack. Not at all. Instead, you had this stark ultimatum, which was met by a really calculated, patient defense. It was a direct clash between two totally different philosophies of warfare. So here's how it broke down. On one side, you have the attacking warlords. Their terms were simple and brutal. Surrender or be reduced to dust. Just a totally aggressive, head-on approach. But on the other side, the defending commander, Mullah Mohammed Omar, he chose a different path, patience. His whole strategy was to just absorb that first big punch, to let the enemy completely exhaust themselves against this prepared, fortified defensive line.
3 days. For 3 straight days, the warlords just unleashed everything they had against that defensive belt. We're talking a relentless barrage, heavy artillery, repeated ground assaults just hammering the positions. But the line held. It held firm. It did not break.
But then, a line was broken. A vulnerability was found and exploited. See, commanders who had actually fled Boldak earlier launched a fresh attack, and from a completely unexpected direction. They managed to seize the critical crossing at Milpol, and just like that, the Taliban's defense was split in two. For a moment there, it really looked like the warlords' brute force strategy had actually paid off.
Well, that success was short-lived. In fact, it was fleeting. A fierce and immediate counteroffensive was launched, led by Mullah Rahmatullah Akund. The response was, well, it was swift, it was overwhelming, and it was absolutely decisive. The enemy forces at Milpol weren't just pushed back, they were crushed.
So what did that failure cost the warlords? Well, the price was steep. The Taliban seized their vehicles, they took prisoners, and they secured a huge cache of military supplies. And at the same time, another operation overran ammunition depots in the nearby Pasha Mountain, which gave them massive stockpiles. This wasn't just a tactical win anymore, it had just turned into a major strategic gain.
Right, so this success, the defense, the counterstrike, it created the perfect opportunity. This was the moment for the campaign's decisive action, a coordinated two-pronged night assault on the enemy's stronghold at Takht-e-Pul. This was the turning point.
You could feel it at this point. The enemy's momentum was fading. The warlords' final offensive, it was just collapsing. And Mullah Mohammed Omar, he sensed it. He knew their momentum was gone, and he recognized this was the perfect moment for a definitive counterattack, one that would finally break the enemy's back.
And the plan? It was a classic pincer movement. Mullah Mohammed Omar split his forces into two separate assault units. He personally took command of the uphill advance. Meanwhile, the downhill attack was led by Mullah Sirajuddin Akhund. The whole idea was to strike the enemy from two directions at the exact same time.
But the really critical element here was the timing. They launched the attack at night. Using that cover of darkness gave them maximum surprise, and it severely limited the enemy's ability to put up any kind of effective defense. And the effect was immediate. I mean, just moments after the assault kicked off, both Taliban units breached the enemy lines. The warlords' forces were just swiftly defeated on both fronts. The two attacking groups then linked up right in the center of Takht-e-Pul, securing the entire area. Just like that.
Now, victory at Takht-e-Pul, that wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. It was the beginning of the next phase. This success was immediately converted into a relentless pursuit, all designed to make sure the enemy had absolutely no chance to regroup.
So, starting from Takht-e-Pul, the fighters pressed the retreating warlords all through the night. There was only one objective: keep up the pressure. Drive these broken enemy forces all the way back to Kandahar airport, which was really their last significant stronghold.
And they were moving fast. The pursuing force crossed the strategic Torkodal Pass, which was a clear signal that they were closing in on the city's perimeter. The pressure was absolutely constant, and the pursuit was unbroken.
And then, right at this critical moment, a command comes over the radio. It's from Mullah Sahib, who's monitoring the whole advance. The order was direct, disciplined, and maybe a little surprising. Halt near the airport.
So you have to ask, why halt the advance? I mean, total victory is right there, in sight. Well, that order came from a place of strategic patience. Mullah Sahib figured that going into a dense city in the dark, in the middle of a chaotic rout, that was just asking for trouble. Unacceptable risks of friendly fire, of civilian casualties. It was a calculated, very disciplined pause. That tactical discipline, right at the edge of the city, set the stage for the final act. As dawn broke, the last bits of organized resistance just collapsed, and that led to the complete capture of Kandahar.
By morning, Kandahar airport was taken. There were some last-minute reinforcements that showed up under a commander named Wahab Khan, but after a short, sharp fight, they were defeated too. The final resistance was officially broken.
So what happened to the opposition's command structure? Well, it just disintegrated. Wahab Khan, he was captured alive along with two other commanders, Abdullah Khan and Baro. Another, named Mansour, was shot and killed while fleeing through the desert. His body was actually displayed near the airport as a pretty grim warning. And then you have Mullah Naqib, a key factional leader. He just dissolved his forces and surrendered all his equipment without even putting up a fight.
With the senior leadership completely neutralized, the final pockets of resistance just evaporated. It was like watching the last dominoes fall. The last commander, a man named Sarkatib, pulled back after a brief clash, and that was it. It allowed for the clearing of the final districts of Kakrez and Shawalakot, and just like that, the entire region was secure.
And that was it. The campaign was complete. Through that initial patient defense, followed by a decisive counterattack, and then a highly disciplined pursuit, the first capital of Afghanistan, the strategic heart of the South, was now under singular control.
So the fall of Kandahar really leaves us with a fundamental question, one about history and about power. What are the consequences, both the ones you see right away and the ones that echo for generations, when a nation's strategic and symbolic heartland falls so swiftly and so completely? Something to think about.